Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Dr. Barbara Lane. Would you ask Dr. Lane to come in, please? Good morning, Dr. Lane.
Morning.
That's it. Make yourself comfortable.
Yeah,
Get a
sorry.
drink
Thank you.
and settle in.
Yep. 2 ticks.
Yes, Mr. Nick, when you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good morning. Good morning, members of the panel. Dr. Lane, good morning to you.
Morning.
Yesterday, we were talking about timescales and levels of priority actions in light of risk.
Yes.
Can we go back to that topic?
Yes.
And I'd like to show you next, please, CST 403177. This is Carl Stokes's October 2014 FRA action plan. And if you look with me at the priority timescales, here you now see high 2 to 3 weeks, medium 2 to 3 months, low 6 to 12 months. And then in brackets after it, it says to start to action any works.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Stokes's evidence was that the newly added qualification in the brackets that we can see there applied to all of the timescales listed. And what he said that it meant, and I'm paraphrasing his evidence, that if possible, the work should be completed within the timescale. But if that wasn't possible, for example, for financial reasons, then the work had to be started within the timescale, but not necessarily finished. And for our references, that's day 130 at page 40 to page 41 at line 13. Now, my question for you is that caveat qualification to start any action, to action any works, found in any government guidance or the 2012 version of PAS 79 at the time?
To start works in a time frame, no. Not that I'm aware of.
No. Was it part of any training that you would have expected fire risk assessors to be provided?
Absolutely not. And if it was in someone's training and I wasn't there, I think it was the wrong thing to train a fire risk assessor to do.
Right. And was it something consistent with or approved by the competency criteria?
Oh, I don't think so at all, no.
Do you agree with this proposition that the consequence of the caveat being applied to the timescales for the actions meant that actions, even if high priority actions, could be left to continue indefinitely once started?
No, I think that's the exact opposite intent of the order and carrying out a fire risk assessment.
In your experience, was the application of a qualification like this to start any action works within 6 to 12 months a common practice? Not
that I've seen in my own work and people their work I've reviewed.
Right. And
outside ARAP as well, sorry, just should be clear. So when I've reviewed other people's work outside ARAP, I don't consider that to be common practice.
Right.
And I would advise that it was entirely incorrect if it was written in a risk assessment.
Right. And if it was, as we can see here, written in a risk assessment, in your opinion, would that fall below the standards of a reasonably competent fire risk assessor?
Yes, it does, yes.
Thank you. Now, Carl Stokes told us that it was for Janice Ray to judge the completion date. Would you expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to leave that decision to the client, the responsible person, without advising them about the risks of not completing remedial actions within the recommended timescale?
No, I wouldn't. And we talked yesterday about this really important role the responsible person has working with the fire risk assessor about forming pragmatic timescales for very complex, if there's a complex problem in the building.
And you say in your report, and I think I can summarise it without going to it, it's paragraph 9.12.23 in chapter 8 at page 221, BLARP 250/27, page 221, you say that Mr. Stokes failed to describe in his assessment what the impact on the risk level would be should the KCTMO fail to undertake these actions in the time frame specified.
Yep.
Can you tell us what is, in your opinion, what is the significance of that omission?
So we touched on this yesterday. So it means the responsible person doesn't know, and they're meant to know, having been given the risk assessment, what risks to life exists in their building. And remember, that's also, there's another function there too about the vulnerability of people. So the risk to life is also a function of, the occupancy profile in the building as well. And the responsible person has to understand that when contemplating this cost problem we talked about yesterday and the practicalities of fixing something that might be complex. Many things are very easy to fix, so that's not relevant.
Yes, yeah. No, thank you. Can I look at a different action plan with you then?
Yeah.
Adair Tower. This one is dated 11th of November 2015 at CST 409046. And I'd like in that document to go with you to page 5. And on page 5, you can see that at the top of the page, it says 12I, strong advice, priority strong advice.
Yeah.
And if you go across the page, you can see under identified risk or hazard, the flat entrance doors in this building have rising butt hinges on most of them. A good percentage of the flat entrance doors in this building are to be changed for new doors, item 12C above. And then he's under the heading actions to be taken. You can see he writes, I would recommend that any flat entrance doors in this building that do not have self-closing devices fitted to them have self-closing devices fitted. And TMO action. TMO accepts this recommendation and is committed to progressing the installation of self-closing devices as a matter of urgency.
Yeah.
Now, strong advice. I just want to ask you about that. Am I right in thinking that that wasn't defined in the priority timescales either on page 1 of his standard form action plans or in PAS 79?
That's correct, yes.
Are you aware of any published guidance supporting the use of that term?
No.
Are you familiar at all with its use outside the guidance?
Well, people will use the phrase strong advice if they're communicating. But in terms of, I think this shows just several fundamental technical errors in a risk assessment, just this row. So the risk the door closers and the door sets pose is not explained to the responsible person. Strong advice has no meaning in the context of the risk to life. And then the timing, is it urgent? Is it strong advice that this is completed in 4 weeks? Or it's my strong advice that this is such a risk to life, the following needs to happen. So the phrase strong advice is used, but it doesn't communicate risk or timing.
No, thank you. Absolutely. And to the best of your experience and knowledge, is the expression strong advice a known category of risk? Prioritisation?
No. It isn't. If people use it, I would ask why. And even if you go back to the base document, I think it's 8880, which PAS 79 is based on, which is actually a very informative document. You can read it another time. They provide lots of really helpful information on those grades and what it means and how costs can be factored in.
Yes.
Okay.
And just for our note, 8880 is the British standard.
Yes, and it's referred to from the past, and actually Mr. Stokes refers to it himself in his own risk assessments.
Now, can I just ask you to look at an email from the time? This is 20th of November 2015, some 9 days after the document that we're looking at. And this is CST 3026445. And if I start at the bottom of page 1 in this document over to page 2, you can see it's an email from Barbara Matthews, very bottom of page 1 there, 20th of November, to Carl Stokes, although you can't see that, copy to Janice Ray. And if we go over to page 2 at the very top, Barbara Matthews says to Carl Stokes, Carl, yesterday when we met, we agreed that high priority items are stated as such due to the legal or regulatory requirement to undertake the action. As this is not the case with retrofitting self-closers, I'm not sure why you would be stating it as a high priority. We've agreed internally that we will arrange for a programme of fitting self-closers on existing doors to be undertaken quickly. However, as we are unable to enforce this for leaseholders, we would be unable to action them. as currently described, our programme will concentrate on tenants' doors and will strongly advise leaseholders to follow suit. We do not want this to be in a position with the LFB that they can issue a deficiency notice for all doors, as we would be unable to fully action this. We would be giving the fitting of self-closers where we can a high priority, and to note that all new doors fitted would have self-closers fitted anyway. Hopefully you can now at least downgrade this priority to a medium, if not low. And that's what she asks him to do. And then his reply, you can see, is on page 1. If we scroll up to that, please. You can see that after an intermediary email, his reply at the top of page 1, Barbara, correct, please see attached to sent back to Janice, now called item 12I. And that's what had strong advice in it, as opposed to a high priority. Now, Mr. Stokes agreed in his evidence that appeared to show that the TMO had placed pressure on him to downgrade his advice from high to strong advice, whatever that meant. And that's day 138, page 201 at lines 12 to 14. My question for you, Dr. Lane, is, were Carl Stokes' actions in downgrading a priority action and one as important as self-closing devices on flat entrance doors something you would expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to do?
No, I wouldn't.
No, you wouldn't. Now, can I then turn to a slightly different topic, which is review of FRAs? Can we go back to past 79, please? CTA 703, page 62, clause 20.2. And I want to look with you at the left-hand column. And under recommendations, which 20.1 deals with what the fire risk assessment should be subject to review when things happen, and you've identified those earlier in your evidence.
Yes.
If we look at 20.2, it says, when the fire risk assessment is reviewed, it should be confirmed whether work recommended in the original action plan has been carried out.
That's correct.
And if you look at the commentary on page 61, we go back a page, please, to little Roman 5, second paragraph on the right-hand column. Can you read that?
Yes, I can now.
You can. It says, when the fire risk assessment is reviewed, consideration needs to be given to the extent to which the original action plan has been implemented. Work that has not been completed needs to be identified. Now, that last sentence there, I just want to ask you about. On the basis of that guidance, where some or all of the actions haven't been undertaken, would you expect that fact to be expressly documented in the next FRA for that building?
Yes, I would, because it's a sign that the fire risk management system is not being implemented, if it's been recorded correctly, is not being implemented because the responsible person hasn't either bothered or been able to close out the actions, and that affects the risk level in the building. And
would that include the fact that the item, the FRA action, has gone past the due date? In other words, the deadline?
Yes, and that's why the due date being, let's say, fair and reasonable is so important.
Yes, thank you. Now, if we look at the template to PAS 79 at Annex E at page 112 of this same document, please, we can see that the template actually picks this point up. I'm saying that. We can see it. Action on previous action plan, towards the bottom of the screen. Have all previous recommendations been satisfactorily addressed? Yes, no. Brief details of recommendations not yet implemented. Now, in your report, you say, and I'll show this to you, BLARP 25027, page 59. This is chapter 8. And I want just to look at paragraph 5.5.10. There it is, middle of the screen. You've set out this extract from PAS 79 Annex E there, under figure 5.3, and under it you say, the input of actions to the previous action plan and to the new action plan is critical, as in either case it is a record as to whether the implementation of the action plan would reduce fire risk to or maintain it at the following level, trivial or tolerable. Now, this sounds like a slightly silly question, but in the light of what you said, but could you just explain to us what is the importance of including that information in the FRA action plan?
FRA, the action plan, because you're trying to communicate to the responsible person, first of all, what the actions are, why they're a risk to life, why they need to be included in a certain time frame, and the consequences in the context of a risk to life if they're not closed out.
Yes.
Okay, so it's to help the responsible person understand, I keep saying about risk acceptance, they have to know the risk they're carrying in that building and causing the relevant people.
And would you expect to see this box in this template you've set out here reproduced in Mr. Stokes's fire risk assessments or in his action plans?
Well, not necessarily this box, because lots of us, communicate that in a different style.
Right.
But the purpose of it, which is I've checked, 8 of the 10 actions were not closed out. 8 of them were a substantial risk to life. So that means now I need to, in my next risk assessment, I cannot accept that this is a responsible person who has a fire risk management system I can rely on for controlling hazards in the building.
Yes.
That's a stark description if the actions are serious.
Yes. And in the light of that, if a fire risk assessor had not either included this box or advice
something with
like
the intention, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
If they'd not done that and had failed to identify whether previous recommendations had been satisfactorily addressed or identify those which had not, how, in your opinion, could a fire risk assessor adequately assess the fire risk in the building concerned?
They can't.
They can't.
And that's why the word review is used in the order.
And
in my technical opinion, apologies. Yeah.
And would it follow from that in your opinion, any fire risk assessment which did not contain either the information as indicated in this box or equivalent not be a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment?
Yes, it is my opinion.
Thank you.
That it is, yes, I'm agreeing.
And does it follow from that failure to include that information would fall below the standards of a reasonably competent fire risk assessment?
It should do, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, if we look at a document in October 2016, this is after the final fire risk assessment done by Carl Stokes for Grenfell Tower in June 2016. This is CST 403137. CST 403137. This is a letter dated 19th of October 2016 in which Mr. Stokes identified 23 actions that were outstanding from the previous fire risk assessment of 20th of June 2016. All of those were identified as high priority and therefore should have been completed on his own timescale within 2 to 3 weeks.
Yes.
Is that something that you would have expected Mr. Stokes to have commented on or advised on in this letter?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
And particularly how the outstanding FRA actions fed into the risk rating for the building?
Yes, and it meant his risk assessment wasn't being dealt with as he required because he set that deadline.
Yeah.
It meant it wasn't being dealt with as he's required, and I would like to know what that meant in terms of the risk to life.
Yes. And would that have an impact then on the adequacy of the advice so far as it affects the TMO's fire risk management systems?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And in circumstances where a fire risk assessor becomes aware of a particular fire risk to premises outside the visit for the purposes of fire risk assessments, because he's been told something on a separate visit, for example, he picks up information that people are removing self-closing devices, would you expect that person to check any of the specific risks that had been identified when doing the next FRA?
Oh, yes. Because, yes. Yeah.
Yes. And would it follow from that if those items are outstanding and impacted on by new information, that would need to be recorded?
Yes, it would, because if the high priority items were a risk to life, and you said there that Mr. Stokes said everybody knew high priority meant statutory breach. I haven't found that written down anywhere. But if that was the case, if the high priority actions were statutory breaches and a significant risk to life, which door closers and faulty doors can be, and 6 months on or a few months on, the responsible person is not controlling that risk, your next risk assessment, you have to now consider increased harm to all the different types of relevant person, because the fire risk management system is not providing the controls a fire risk assessor should be allowed to rely on. Okay?
Yes, thank you. Can I then turn to a different topic, which is Mr. Stokes' training, qualifications and experience? Can we start with PAS 79, CTA 703, page 24? And let's look together at the commentary on that page under Clause 7, particularly Roman numeral 5, bottom right-hand part of your screen, which says, in general, other than in the case of a simple low-risk premises, fire risk assessors, particularly those offering their services on a commercial basis, e.g. consultants, need, and there are then 5 items identified there. I don't need to read them to you, A to E. I'm going to assume you're familiar with those requirements.
Yes.
Yes. Now, keeping those in mind and looking at Mr. Stokes' training, can we go to your report at Chapter 8, BLARP 25027, page 88. Chapter 8, paragraph 6.5.23. You say there, top of the screen, therefore there is evidence that by 2010, when tendering for KCTMO's medium risk programme, Mr. Stokes had undertaken a range of fire safety relevant training courses. Is it your opinion that Mr. Stokes had, in general, sufficient training as contemplated by PAS 79, as we've looked at just now, bearing in mind that this edition was published in August 2012, to carry out fire risk assessments when he was appointed as TMO's sole fire risk assessor in September 2010?
I think that I think if I was the reader of the list of the courses he had attended, it would be reasonable for me to assume that he had sufficient training. It's really hard for me. Like I'd have to review all the courses and understand what he learned. So I think I'm probably taking it a bit too far. But he had attended courses relevant to the duties, to his duties.
And those identified in PAS 79?
Mr. Millett, I haven't done a big list of training courses and equated them over to those 5 bullet points, and I'm a bit thorough that way. So I haven't done that. Okay. I haven't done a big cross-check. But I think his training courses were useful to him. It's hard for me to give a view on that now because of all that I've learnt about how he worked. Okay, so it's hard for me to give a view without factoring that in.
All right. I mean, impressionistically, without having done the
impressionistically, I think it was a good list.
Right.
Okay, but I think that's a bit of a glib thing for me.
No, I understand.
Yeah,
understand. Now, in respect of his experience to be a fire risk assessor, we heard in his evidence that by the time he was appointed to be the TMO's fire risk assessor for the medium risk buildings in September 2010, the only fire risk assessment he'd carried out while at Oxfordshire FRS were for fire stations. That's day 136, page 15, lines 5 to 16. Yeah. But apart from that, he was in the role of auditing other people's fire risk assessments. That's what he said on the same page of the transcript. And he didn't audit or conduct a fire risk assessment of a high-rise block of flats. Yeah. And he also told us that by the time he retired from Oxfordshire Fire and Rescue Service, he had 3 years of fire safety experience as auditor and less than 2 years experience as a certified fire risk assessor. Day 136, page 20, lines 1 to 7. Yeah. Now, I've laid that out for you at some speed. I can go back.
No, that's okay. I understand the point. Yeah.
The question in light of that is, given his evidence, is it your opinion that Carl Stokes had sufficient experience to carry out fire risk assessments of high-rise residential blocks?
No, I don't think he did.
Now, can we go to your Chapter 11, BLARP 25040, page 16?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Millett. I just wonder whether we ought to leave that answer just there. I mean, Could you just explain to us what it is,
Yeah.
or what is required in relation to a fire risk assessment of a high-rise residential building that was outside the scope of Mr. Stokes's experience, as you understand it to have been?
Yeah, well, actually, I was asked specifically about high-rise, so I answered that question.
Of course.
Okay. So I have views about training. I have professional views about training and experience. So I think we can go on all sorts of training courses and they're very informative, but I don't think that solely places you in a position to carry out a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment. And that's a professional opinion of mine, because there's quite a deep understanding, as we've seen in this, this huge analysis of what's happened at Grenfell Tower, in understanding fire safety provisions and how buildings are constructed. And on a training course to carry out a fire risk assessment in all good faith, you can't transfer all, that extent of knowledge on a simple, and it's good to do the training, but you can't get that level of understanding of buildings on a training course, okay? If you had asked me if Mr. Stokes or any person who had done some training and didn't have experience in either design hazard assessment or the operating side of a building hazard assessment, and they're sent off to carry out a fire risk assessment of, I think Grenfell Tower was a complex building. I don't think they're in a position to do that, and I'm aware that others are of that view too. Okay, but I don't want to denigrate training, because I think it is very important. But competence is knowledge, skill, experience, and training. That was a bit of a long answer, but anyway, that's just my opinion based on all the things I've seen for a long time.
It suggests to me that, in your view, a person should not take sole or primary responsibility for the fire risk assessment of a high-rise residential building,
yes,
without having previously acted in an assistant or secondary capacity for an assessment of that kind.
Yes,
Is that your
yes,
view?
I do, because certainly for me, I have learnt being on the job and, seeing how other people risk assess the same hazard and everything that comes from that. And you need that breadth of experience to end up being sure that your judgment, there is, whether people like it or not, risk assessment is where a lot of judgment comes in, because every building is different, every operator is different, there isn't always a consistency in every building. And to have sound judgment at the end of the day, even if I use PASS or I use the LGA or I use everything, I may make an error or exercise judgment that will be found wanting in certain circumstances. Is that okay? So, but I know lots of people totally believe in training. I think it's only one strand of becoming competent.
Right. Thank you. Yes, Mr.
Thank you. Yes. Can we look, please, at Chapter 11 of your report, which is BLARP 25040, page 16. And at paragraph 6.1.21, we're on it, foot of the screen. You say that on that basis, I do not consider, and the basis is the basis you've set out in the previous paragraphs, I do not consider Mr. Stokes to have demonstrated a higher level of knowledge regarding higher risk or more complex premises, as PASS 79 would require. Can you explain what higher level of knowledge you would have expected Carl Stokes to have when carrying out FRAs of higher risk or more complex premises?
Well, I think I've kind of answered that question already now, haven't I? I think I have.
Do
you mean like another course or something? Is that what you're trying to ask?
Well, let me try this. What would the fire risk assessor, confronted with a building like Grenfell Tower, generically higher risk or more complex, need to know that he wouldn't need to know when assessing a lower risk building? Or is it just a question of judgment and experience?
What does he need to know? Well, okay, so let's take the example that we spoke a lot about yesterday. So in a high-rise residential building, this whole issue of internal walls and external walls, look how complex it's become.
Yes.
Okay? But actually it was always complex. And so the risk assessor, and actually I didn't make something very clear yesterday. The risk assessor needs to be able to understand the fire safety provisions, and I don't think they're simple for high-rise residential buildings. I think they're very interconnected, and there's all sorts of different balancing. They're entitled to be given information about those fire safety provisions. They don't need to go off and work out all the problems on their own the first day, but they need to understand high-rise residential buildings and the complexity of the fire safety provisions made for them under the building regulations when they arrive to carry out their fire risk assessment. And I personally don't think that's simple.
Right, I see. That you may have answered this question in that last answer, but let me see if I can just tease it out. In simple terms, what did Mr. Stokes not have by way of a higher level of knowledge, which, if he had had it, would have equipped him properly to assess Grenfell Tower?
I don't know how to answer that question.
Okay.
Again, it's really hard for me to think about Mr. Stokes at that time, because I've studied what he did for such a long time here. Okay, but if I take the paperwork made available to me about that time, I don't know how much experience he had in looking at high-rise residential buildings or high-rise buildings and the myriad of fire safety provisions that are relied upon to make them safe. I don't know that. So I think probably I can't help you with that question.
Yes, I mean, you said in this part of your report that you don't consider Mr. Stokes to have demonstrated a higher level of knowledge regarding higher risk or more complex premises. My question is really just what is it that's missing?
It was in, I think, you need to read all the sentences which culminate to there.
Yes. Oh, well, let's
so let's just if you look at the italics, it requires a higher level of knowledge and experience on the part of the fire risk assessor. That's what it says up there.
Yes.
Okay. And I think I've spoken at length about knowledge and experience. And I couldn't see that Mr. Stokes had that knowledge and experience from the paperwork at that time.
Right.
That's all I meant.
So you take knowledge and experience as a single composite idea rather than knowledge of and experience as a separate matter?
Oh, I think they're two different things.
Right. So when you deal with knowledge in paragraph 6.1.21, what knowledge, we've covered experience, which you've given us an opinion on. What is it that he didn't know? Oh,
how am I meant to know that? I've never met the man. I can't say that. I think that the words I chose in that last sentence are to do with the italic text above, and I've explained to you that beyond training, knowledge, probably this is better, knowledge comes from training, from experience, from observing the work of others, and from, carrying out tasks. You gain knowledge that way. That's my understanding of knowledge. Okay?
Now, in respect of CPD, continuing professional development, would you expect a fire risk assessor who will not certificated or registered with a professional body to carry out continuing professional development?
If they're not certified?
Yes, a fire risk assessor who was not certificated and who was not registered with a professional body, nonetheless, would you expect them to carry out continuing professional development?
I think any person giving safety advice, it's absolutely imperative that they participate in CPD and other activities that provides them with sufficient skill and knowledge to carry out their role, whether they're registered or not. because it's such an important role and it impacts people so much.
Yes. Is there, to your knowledge, a standard quantity of time, number of hours, that an average competent fire risk assessor would undergo annually?
Yeah, we spoke about this before. I mean, in terms of published hours, if you want to refer to a document to try and find the number of hours, the IFE for risk assessors and for fire safety engineers, I think it's 25 hours a year. The body I'm in at the moment, actually, it's a mandatory 35, and you're not even allowed to pay for your membership unless you can prove you've done them. So there's no one number.
Right.
Okay. But it is about, in my mind, it's about demonstrating commitment to benefiting from other people's knowledge and making sure your skills are up to date.
And if, as a matter of fact, and I stress the word if, Carl Stokes did not do 25 hours per year of CPD, would that failure be a departure from commonly accepted standards? I
mean, in its own right. Do you mean if it was 20 hours instead of 25 hours, or nothing as opposed to 25 hours?
Let's try both. 20 hours?
Yeah, I'm not, I just, like I said, I think there's more to competence than fixed learning, such as CPD. If any person had done 20 hours instead of 25 hours, I wouldn't write a big essay on that.
Right.
I think if someone's not participating at all in any activity that allows them to, assess their own skill and improve their own knowledge as a result of interacting with other people, particularly in safety professions, I think that it is not a signal of competence now.
Yes, thank you. Can I then ask you some questions, Dr. Lane, next about audit and quality assurance and peer review? We can look at your report at Chapter 8, if we can, at BLARP 25027, page 88, which is within this report, BLARP 25027. And we need to look at page 88, paragraph 6.5.26 and 27. Now, at 6.5.26, you say, I note also that section 3.2 of the consultant's brief, page 4 of CST 705, also required, that's a July 2010 document, you'll remember that, the consultants to be able to satisfy the provisions of a quality management system as set out in BSE and ISO 9001. And then at paragraph 6.5.27, you say, I've seen no evidence that Mr. Stokes could satisfy that aspect of the brief. And that's what you say there. And his evidence on day 136 at page 86, lines 11 to 21, is that question never came up for discussion as between him and the TMO. In your examination of the material, have you seen any evidence that his work was peer reviewed?
No. Peer reviewed on his request?
Yes.
Well, it was reviewed later on.
Have you seen any evidence that it was reviewed by?
Do you mean the day-to-day peer review of his work? Sorry, no, I haven't seen any evidence of that. Except there's 2 times when he worked at Salvis.
Yes.
But when he was offering his services now, no, I haven't seen any evidence where anyone ever reviewed his work before it was given to the TMO. Right.
Have you seen any evidence that it was audited either by the TMO or anybody else?
His work. Well, as a matter of course, by the TMO, no. But I did give that one incident I found of some of his risk assessments being sent off, but I wasn't able to establish why that happened.
Right.
But as a matter of course, as part of a quality processes at the TMO, for example, his work was not, I could not see his work was checked.
Would it be normal practice, in your experience, for a fire risk assessor to have no quality management system and no system for audit or peer review of their work?
Did you say is a common practice?
Would it be normal practice, common practice?
So let's talk about acceptable practice. It isn't.
Right.
Am I aware of other people who operate the same way as Mr. Stokes? Yes, I am.
Right. So it might be common, but it would not be acceptable.
I'm happy to do a survey of the whole industry and come back and give you proper expert advice on that. But anecdotally, there are people who operate on that basis, and there are lots of people who do not.
Does that mean that a person who wishes to set up a business as a fire risk assessor on his own, as was the case with Mr. Stokes, can never satisfy a requirement for peer review?
No, you can make an arrangement, can't you?
I don't know.
That's what I'd do if if after the inquiry I leave ARUP or something and I decide to operate on my own. I was a sole trader. As far as I'm concerned, I would still have to be able to demonstrate to the responsible person their satisfactory checks of my work. And that would mean I would need to pay, a competent fire risk assessor. Maybe I might make arrangements once a year or something. I don't think that's a difficult thing to do. No. And then you can satisfy your own professional integrity and also start to comply with, in a lot of those bids, there's some quite harsh rules about management. So I think that's an easy thing to resolve.
And in your experience, is that what some sole traders do? Or do you just not know?
I think it would be. I hate kind of saying everyone and all and.
No, well, it may not be within your knowledge.
I'm aware of very small companies who, for example, might ask somebody like me to do a check occasionally. Is that a massive part of my work, and does everybody do it? I don't think so.
No, right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
But acceptable practice and common practice, there are two really important differences in this inquiry.
Yes, indeed.
My professional opinion.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Sorry, is that okay?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that's helpful.
Yes. Now, if we go back on in this same document, please, to page 145, you say at paragraphs 8.4.4, 8.4.5 and 8.4.6 of Chapter 8, you say this: nor were KCTMO monitoring the technical quality of what Mr. Stokes was providing by way of by means of his fire risk assessment documents. And then at 8.4.6, for the scale of properties assigned to Mr. Stokes, a sole provider of fire risk assessments for KCTMO's portfolio, this was a significant decision. You use the word decision there. Can you help us? What decision are you referring to?
So if you're responsible for a large portfolio of buildings and you make the decision to invest all fire risk assessment activity in one person, I think that's a really big decision to make. Because any one person, every person makes mistakes and every person needs their work checked. And even, for example, say if ARUP was carrying out fire risk assessments for a portfolio of buildings, it is beneficial to the responsible person that they would get someone in after a few years just to make sure that we weren't, getting lazy. I mean, I don't know if that's appropriate. So having a large portfolio of buildings comes with it a body of risk, and the decision you make about how that risk shall be assessed in every building over a large number of years, I think is a really important decision.
And the decision, as I understand it, is this right? Is the decision by the TMO to retain Mr. Stokes without him having such a system, as opposed to Mr. Stokes deciding not to adopt one?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm talking about the KCTMO. Yeah. They decided to go with the sole trader. And if you've told me what Mr. Stokes did, they did not think it was important, or that's probably the wrong word, they didn't think it was relevant to their decision that there was no quality assurance processes in his business. But I'm much more critical of the lack of checking by the KCTMO of the assumptions and descriptions in Mr. Stokes' report, which was very much for the KCTMO to make accurate.
Yes, thank you. Now, can I turn to a completely different topic, evacuation strategy, and particularly that for Grenfell Tower itself? Can we start with the RRO? Just because it's important, I think, to have the words on the screen so people can see what we're talking about.
Yeah.
This is at INQ 3011327, page 10. And what I'm going to show you is Article 14, emergency routes and exits, and under sub-article 2, it says the following requirements must be complied with in respect of premises where necessary, whether due to the features of the premises, the activity carried on there, any hazard present, or any other relevant circumstances, in order to safeguard the safety of relevant persons. And then A, emergency routes and exits must lead as directly as possible to a place of safety. B, and critically B, in the event of danger, it must be possible for persons to evacuate the premises as quickly and as safely as possible. Now, just taking this a little slowly, first, in your opinion, was it the understanding in the fire risk assessment trade that in the event of danger, using the word there, the responsible person was required to ensure that persons, relevant persons, could evacuate the premises as quickly and safely as possible without the assistance of the fire and rescue service?
Without the I think you were asking, sorry, that was a very long question. So you're asking me if fire risk assessors commonly understood that evacuation would be available without assistance from the fire and rescue services. My understanding is that I cannot rely on the fire and rescue service when I'm preparing an evacuation, and I don't think that other people thought they could rely on the fire and rescue services for evacuation, particularly after the order came out.
And was it the understanding that the obligation in 14.2b there applied regardless of whether the responsible person had a stay-put strategy for those premises?
Well, I think you've heard plenty of evidence here that there's this common understanding that stay-put means no one leaves a building in the event of a fire. And I think I've been very, very clear that that is completely wrong.
So, was it the view that even where a stay-put strategy was in place, any resident of that building affected by fire and or smoke, and therefore exposed to danger, using the word in the article, should also be able to evacuate the premises as quickly and safely as possible?
Most people cite exiting the building by means of the staircase. So yes, when you read other people's risk assessments and my own, it will say arrangements have been made to evacuate the building by means, please use the staircase, by means of the staircase, walk down the staircase.
Yeah. But leaving the staircase on one side and being more general, my question was a general one. Even where you've got a stay-put strategy in place, was it the view in the trade that any resident of the building who was affected by fire and smoke should be able to evacuate the premises as quickly and safely as possible?
No, I can't leave the staircase behind, because what people commonly write for high-rise residential buildings with the stay-put strategy is persons affected by the fire can use the stairs to evacuate. If you're asking me if it was commonly understood that large numbers of people would evacuate down the staircase, no, it wasn't. I think I'm not quite sure what your question really means or what it implies.
But where you've got somebody who's got a fire in their flat
Yes.
and has to leave their flat,
Yes.
was it understood in the industry that those persons should be able to evacuate the premises as quickly and safely as possible?
In the fire risk assessments I've read, it always says people can walk down the staircase in the event of a fire in their flat.
So is the answer to the question yes?
But I think your question's more general than that.
All right.
Yeah.
Where you've got somebody who has to leave their flat because they've got a fire in their
Yes.
flat, was it the understanding of Article 14.2b that their safe evacuation from the building should not depend on the intervention of the Fire and Rescue Service?
Yes.
Yes. Are you aware of and we touched on this to some extent yesterday, but are you aware of a view in the fire risk assessment trade, at least before June 2017, that if people in a high-rise block are in their flats, in their private dwellings, they are not on the premises and therefore are outside the protection of Article 14 altogether?
I'm not aware of that view.
Right.
I've read. I've never had it. I've never seen it stated so factually referring to the order. I have seen people say that evacuation, that be. I don't know how to phrase this. I've never seen anyone write down that in accordance with Article 14, no arrangements need to be made.
Was it your understanding, is it your understanding, that looking at Article 14.2b, that in the event of danger it must be possible for persons to evacuate the premises as quickly and safely as possible, whether or not they're in their flats at the time of the danger? So
whether or not they're in their flats at the time of danger? Do you mean if they're standing out in the lobby?
No, if they're in their living rooms, for example, within their flats.
If they're in their living. Okay, so my understanding of when a fire occurs in a flat, those people have to be able to evacuate, and as all the guidance documents say, anyone in the immediate vicinity who feels exposed to harm should also be able to evacuate. And then anything more extreme than that will be triggered by, there will be an intervention. That's always been my understanding, and that's only my understanding from reading published guidance documents.
Yes, I understand.
I've never heard that if people stay in the flat and don't come out, it's got nothing to do with the responsible person before. No, if that's what you're asking.
Thank you. It was.
Yeah. Sorry, okay, I kind of find it hard to, it's a bit subtle sometimes.
I hope that's not a subtlety introduced by me.
Right, okay, sorry. Yeah, so I've never heard that before, that if you stay in the flat, it's got nothing to do with the responsible person. My reading of the guidance and my understanding as a fire safety professional of the order is that it's everything to do with the responsible person.
Right. Thank you. Now, I think I can move then to a slightly different question. Was it your opinion and an opinion put into practice by you that Article 14, and indeed the RRO taken as a whole, doesn't, at least when one reads it, distinguish between able-bodied and vulnerable persons, so far as their treatment as relevant persons?
No, it doesn't. And that just to be absolutely clear, that's always been my view in my career, not just since the fire at Grenfell.
Was it, to your knowledge, the understanding in the fire risk assessment trade that it, even though it didn't draw that distinction, implicitly a distinction should be drawn by those assessing building risks?
Now, distinctions should be drawn are very, very strong words. My experience of how that's why I kept mentioning use the staircase. That is always cited in risk assessments if you read them. My understanding is it's omitted fully or left with the responsible person to resolve if they become aware of persons with vulnerabilities. I am happy to say, based on my experience for a very long time, that providing protection or evacuation to, I think, did you use, what was the phrase you used? You said able-bodied and...
Vulnerable.
And vulnerable, to vulnerable persons is not something that is consistently dealt with or well received certainly in my work. But I don't think it's implicit. I don't think you said something like it's implicit in the order or the reading. I think you said implicit in the reading of the order. I don't agree with that.
Right.
But I do think that it's something that is not dealt with very well at all, consistently in the profession.
Do I take it from that answer, which was delicately put, that the profession tends, in some quarters, to regard vulnerable persons as apt to receive different treatment when it comes to Article 14(2)(b) from able-bodied persons?
It's not for me to say that.
Well, your last answer indicated that might be your experience and opinion.
I think that, so if you take it back to risk, when the only way out of a high-rise residential building is down the stairs, any percentage of the population that cannot do that is automatically exposed to more harm in the same building. And so the risk level calculated for that percentage of the population is technically different. It's higher than the risk level calculated for the able-bodied population. And where that's omitted or a solution can't be found, that causes, yes, a difference in risk level, doesn't it, in terms of where you sit in the occupancy profile.
And when you say in your answer a moment ago that in your experience for a very long time, providing protection or evacuation to vulnerable persons was not something consistently dealt with or well received.
Yes, I've had, yes.
Can you explain what you mean?
I have had lots of professional experience where it's been very difficult for me to reach an agreement that the risk level is different and that may be an additional control or an additional protection is required. That's my own professional experience, but other people have to give their experiences too.
No, thank you very much. That's very helpful and very clear. Now, can I then show you Article 14(2) again and just look at some words there?
Yeah.
I've read them before. It says the following requirements must be complied with in respect of premises where necessary. You see the words where necessary. Was it the understanding of the fire risk assessment trade that evacuation planning for residents was not necessary, using the word there, where there was a stay-put strategy?
Again, I've never heard it described in such a clear way off the article, okay, because that would have been quite helpful.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Mr. Millett, your question rather assumed that there was a general view within what you've called the fire risk assessment trade. I'm not sure that Dr. Lane has said that she was aware of any general view one way or the other.
Yeah,
she may be able to say that.
So you're being very, very specific with me about words in Article 14. I can safely say I've rarely heard an argument pieced together on the basis of a clear reading of Article 14, because that would be quite thorough.
Right.
Okay. No.
But thoroughness
very
is
important. It's very important.
Why is that a problem?
Because the decision not to provide an evacuation means from a high-rise residential building, when the fire, because we're not talking about the extreme event that ended up occurring at Grenfell at the moment. When there's a fire in a flat, it typically, if in unsprinklered buildings, it will stay in the flat. It might spread to the flat next door. So it's relatively localised. All those people have to be able to evacuate the building. That's just in the, this normal scenario.
Yes.
When a responsible person takes the decision that anyone who can't get down the stairs somehow, walking, shuffling, there's all sorts of, in extreme measures, things beyond walking are deemed acceptable. Any person who makes that decision knowingly is leaving people in those the reasonable scenario flat fires without a means of escape. Actually, I can't even remember what the question was now. Sorry, I feel I've gone off point completely.
No, that is I think the answer to my next question. It follows from, I think, what you said before.
Yeah. So any risk assessor that doesn't make that clear, as far that clear, because sometimes it can be a very difficult problem to resolve. I'm very, very aware of that. But any risk assessor that does not make that clear is not carrying out a suitable and sufficient risk assessment, because they've not expressed the different risk level to any person who can't evacuate in those, let's call them normal circumstances, which requires walking down the staircase.
Yes. Yes, thank you. So, two things follow from that. The first is it an acceptable evacuation strategy simply to say, stay put? Is stay put an evacuation strategy?
Stay put has been an evacuation strategy in this country since the 1970s. It means people leave the building immediately in the event of a fire in the fire zone, and that the building is safe enough that the fire won't spread and that it will remain safe to stay in your flat. That's what stay put means.
And does the responsible person need to make sure that the general fire precautions encompass everyone in the building, regardless of whether they are or are not staying put?
That's my understanding. That's my understanding. Others will have to come here about the order. But that's, as a practitioner, that is my understanding of what's required.
And is that understanding the same, regardless of any differences in that person's abilities, physical or mental abilities, as far as they may affect their escape?
It's relevant persons. There's no category of relevant person as a function of mobility.
Now, can I then ask you to look at Article 15, just below this on the page? We'll need to scroll down to it. Yeah. It's headed Procedures for Serious and Imminent Danger and Danger Areas. Yeah. And it reads, 15.1, the responsible person must establish and, where necessary, give effect to appropriate procedures, including safety drills, to be followed in the event of serious and imminent danger to relevant persons. And then B, nominate a sufficient number of competent persons to implement those procedures insofar as they relate to the evacuation of relevant persons from the premises. Yeah. And then over the page at C, ensure that no relevant person has access to any area to which it is necessary to restrict access on grounds of safety unless the person concerned has received adequate safety instruction. Yes. Now, according to that provision, and this is my summary of it, so it's...
Could we go back so I can see A and B?
Yes, of course. Please go to the bottom of page 10.
Yeah.
Just look at that. Well, rather than interpolating that for you, is it your opinion, and was it your practice, that applied to everyone in the building, regardless of their vulnerabilities or not? Yeah,
so it's my understanding of the order and most of the guidance published about it, that I have a duty to, the responsible person has a duty to deal with that. But I know it is not. It is the one thing I know that is not common practice to do it. Because you asked me about practice as well there.
Yes, I see.
So I think it's a requirement, and acceptable practice is to do it. But I am aware of, very many circumstances I have found myself in where it is not done.
But if it's not done, would you advise your clients that if they didn't do it, that they were in breach of the order?
I think I have to explain. It's as I said, because the more vulnerable you are, and if that vulnerability is relevant to a building where the only way out is the staircase and one cannot use the staircase, the responsible person has to understand the risk level is much higher to a particular portion of the relevant persons.
Was it? We overspoke each other, I'm afraid.
Oh, sorry.
No, it was both of us. But do I understand it that if your client said, would you? Well, let me ask you this way: would you advise a client that if they didn't treat all persons the same, for the purposes of establishing these procedures, that they would be in breach of the regulation?
I have, yes.
Yes.
But it's not a very popular opinion.
No, I'm sure it's not.
Mr. Millett, this must be a question of construction of the order, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
you can ask the witness about whether she's aware of any generally accepted view within the industry.
Yeah.
But what the meaning of the order is, surely is a matter of law.
the meaning of the order is a matter of law.
Yeah.
The use of the order and the expert's understanding of it in her practice is a matter for her
Well,
opinion.
if you're going to ask her about a general understanding within the trade, as you put it, of the fire risk assessor,
Yeah.
she may or may not be able to tell us whether she's aware of any general understanding one way or another.
Yeah.
Well, what I was asking him, Mr. Chairman,
Well, we
was...
never got to that point.
What was her advice?
Earlier.
Well, my question was, would you advise a client?
Well, that's just telling us what she would do.
Yes, but that's relevant. Because
I'm not sure it is.
Well, she's an expert. She's been called as an expert in this field, and what the expert customarily does, customarily takes from the governing...
All I'm seeking to identify is that
helpful.
we're not at the moment exploring aspect of a general understanding of
No,
those
that's
that conduct fire risk assessment.
No, but I don't need to, because she's told us that it's not popular.
Right.
So my next question was it generally understood? And I think the answer is no. It was not accepted.
Was it, sorry, say, what was your last question, sorry? What did you say, was it?
Was it the general understanding in the fire risk assessment industry? Let me try it this way.
Yeah.
The advice that you would give about compliance to your clients.
Yeah, when I'm paid to do so, to put it that way. So when I'm paid to give advice on compliance, which I am a lot.
Yes.
Yes.
Is the advice that you customarily give about not distinguishing between vulnerable persons and non-vulnerable persons?
Absolutely, and I'm not unique in that regard. Okay, I'm not unique in that regard. I've been saying since yesterday I can't do the big everyone does, because I think it's wrong. But I am aware, because of certain circumstances where I have been paid to advise responsible people, that it can be difficult to deal with this matter about having different levels of mobility or capability, particularly to use a staircase. So a high-rise residential building is quite unique in that regard. Other buildings have different ways to evacuate. That's what makes a high-rise residential building so different. They typically have one staircase, and if you can't walk down a staircase, you're left with not very much else to protect you.
Can we look at your report, BLARP 25034, at page 16? And I'd like to look at paragraph 2.3.11 at page 16, chapter 6. And you say at 2.3.11, this, at the foot of the screen, in the context of a residential building with a stay-put strategy, the relevant persons considered for each scenario would, as a minimum, be A, occupants of the flat of fire origin who make their escape, and B, occupants in any adjacent flats who initially remain in place unless their flat becomes affected from heat and or smoke, and 3, if we get, or C, if we go over the page, all other occupants in the building
Yeah.
should a simultaneous evacuation strategy become necessary.
Yeah.
2 questions. First, is it your opinion that the responsible person must ensure that the relevant person can evacuate for each of those 3 scenarios?
I think they should be able to, yes.
Is it also your opinion that the responsible person must also establish appropriate procedures for each one of these 3 scenarios?
No.
Not.
No, because the guidance is very clear that A and B are I'm going to use the word reasonable. I don't think it's put in that terms. But if something unusual happens, it may be called by the fire and rescue services that a more substantial evacuation shall occur. So the so-called simultaneous evacuation, when it's described in any of the guidance documents, that tends to be in circumstances where an intervention is required.
Now,
so I wouldn't expect someone to necessarily plan for that.
Right. I can understand A and B, because A and B are in essence part of the standard stay-put strategy, I think.
A, B and C are part of the stay-put strategy.
Well, looking at C, why would it not be reasonable, well, let me try it a different way, where all other occupants in the building need to be considered where a simultaneous evacuation becomes necessary?
Yeah.
What would you expect
Okay.
a building owner to put in place in that eventuality?
So we went through this in huge detail in phase 1, that the whole issue with triggering the total evacuation of a high-rise residential building in England before the Grenfell fire is there's no means to do that unless the fire brigade do that. And we've been through, I don't think we need to go back to, there's all sorts of complexity there about building systems not being provided to enable that.
Right, so...
Okay, so I can't say, I've never said to a client, therefore you need to plan for that anyway. I've never done that. So, sorry.
Nonetheless, those persons falling in category C, namely anybody in the building, is not somebody, is this your opinion, is not somebody who is a relevant person for the purposes of Articles 14 and 15? Or are they a relevant person for the purposes of those articles?
I'm really not sure. Well, if you can answer the question.
Well, I'm just going to say, I feel I'm being quite glib. When do you switch from being a relevant person to not a relevant person in the middle of a fire?
Well, the reason I'm asking you that question is because you've said here the relevant persons would as a minimum be.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in...
Go back
in your opinion, under in the category of people.
Can you just go
C.
back the page? Go back the page. Let me just see. Yeah. So I probably this is because I'm not a lawyer. I'm struggling a bit now. But I think in my mind, I've never thought about this before. But in my mind, in a fire, you're always a relevant person. I don't think that ends at some point. I've been very, very clear in phase 1 that once you get to C, provisions are not made in any building to enable C. It has to be done by the fire and rescue services.
And on that subject, is it your understanding of the practice in the industry that that responsible persons should take all reasonable steps to enable the fire and rescue service to effect an evacuation of all relevant persons should it become necessary?
I'm not aware that... I think... I'm not aware that... Remember, there's different types of high-rise buildings as well, sprinklered and unsprinkled. There's a whole series of features here that make a building high risk. Not all high-rise residential buildings are high risk, but anyway. I am not aware that it's common practice, and it's not my common practice, to make arrangements for a total evacuation of a premises in the absence of the fire and rescue services. And I think I think you're asking me to get involved in something that I shouldn't be now, because the total evacuation of a high-rise residential building is meant to be a rare and by definition, an extreme event, or when an extreme hazard has occurred, and the responsible, the fire safety provisions, and then how the responsible person manages that building, all together are meant to mean it's by absolute exception you end up in that extreme event.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment for a break?
I think it probably is. Thank you. Yes, we'll have a break now.
Yeah.
Dr. Lane, no talking to anyone, should you be so inclined.
Yeah, no.
Please, thank you very much. 25 to 12, please. Thank you. Would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Dr. Lane, ready to carry on?
Yeah.
Good.
I think,
Yes?
you know, that last exchange is very complicated, and I probably want to be very clear that, you know, we all know what we know now, but back then, which is what we're meant to be speaking of, in terms of the A, B and C you had on the screen, remember the fire safety provisions are meant to be fit for purpose. The responsible person is looking after them and controlling hazards, and they're the steps they plan and organise to make sure C is never needed. That is the whole goal of the original stay put strategy.
I follow.
Okay? And I think that's all that is appropriate for me to say.
I follow. Thank you very much.
Okay.
That's very clear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we then look at the LGA guide at HOM 3045964, page 27, and I want to look at section 18 with you, which is entitled Evacuation Strategy.
Yeah.
And under Evacuation Strategy, paragraphs 18.1 and 18.2 explain the principles of compartmentation, and then 18.3 says, this is the essence of the stay put principle. It has underpinned fire safety design standards from even before the 1960s, when national standards were first drafted. It is still the basis upon which blocks of flats are designed today. In the majority of existing blocks, it remains entirely valid. And then 18.4, inevitably fires do occur in which, for operational reasons, the fire and rescue service decides to evacuate others in the building. Fires have been known to spread beyond the flat of origin, to involve other flats, or to spread across the tops of blocks through the roof voids. In these cases, total evacuation of the block has sometimes been necessary. Fortunately, these fires are rare. They are usually the fault of failings in the construction. Now, when it says that they are rare, was it your understanding, or rather, as far as you can speak to it, the trade's understanding, that although they were rare, they were not unforeseeable?
I suppose it depends on, this is where knowledge becomes very important. So, I mean, are you talking to me now about the years leading up to Grenfell? Because I'm meant to be here talking about Grenfell. So are you talking about the years before?
Yes.
Yeah. So there are well-documented external wall fires. You've heard all about that from other people here.
Yes.
I've told you I have project-based experience from 2013. So based on my experience and my knowledge, while it's foreseeable, it shouldn't be, what's the right word? It's foreseeable in the event of inappropriate construction materials being used, not foreseeable as a matter of course.
Yes.
And I don't think it's for me to declare a kind of a foreseeability status for a whole profession.
No.
Okay. But that does rely on knowledge, and knowledge of past fires is a very important part of maintaining competence.
If compartmentation were either to fail in a widespread way or to be bypassed, would that constitute a serious and imminent danger to relevant persons?
Yes, it does.
It does. Is it your opinion that the responsible person should have a plan which ensures that a resident can evacuate as quickly and as safely as possible in the rare but not unforeseeable event that compartmentation did fail?
I think the responsible person needs to make sure the internal compartmentation, together with the external wall, remains reliable, so that they are not entering into the deeply complex territory of needing to plan for the total evacuation of a high-rise residential building.
I see. So, just to understand, is it your opinion that, in fact, the responsible person should not need to establish an effective procedure in the event of total failure of compartmentation, because they shouldn't get to that position in the first place?
Yeah, so their procedures should be you remember, we've used the word practical, and, there's, So their procedures should be focused on the maintenance of fire protection, active and passive. So that's the best means to prevent the relevant persons ending up in the circumstances a total evacuation is required. But I don't want anyone to think that the fire risk assessor and the responsible person, when they're left in the scenario where, for example, the external wall hasn't been handed over properly in the first place, it's all interconnected, okay? But they do need to know if the wall has become a hazard, internal or external, and that the compartmentation they're so reliant on is no longer as reliable as they need it to be, and that's the best protection, the best control, instead of simply planning for a total evacuation.
Right. Can I just show you then what Mr. Todd said in his evidence on this subject? See if
before you do, Mr. Millett, can I just try and tease that last answer out a little bit?
Yes, of course.
See if I've understood it correctly. Yeah. Ultimately, I think you would say we're always talking about risk here.
Yes.
And would it be fair to say that in most cases, the risk of a catastrophic failure of the building of a kind that would require a total evacuation is too small to justify taking precautions against?
It should be.
Well, should be, sorry.
It should be, yes. Agreed. So that's exactly the point, that you've taken all these different steps to bring the probability of occurrence and because this is about consequences having to do a total evacuation. You're taking all reasonable steps to limit the probability of that occurrence, so that you don't have to deal with those consequences, the consequence being a total evacuation of the building.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, it's all about risk. So the less fire safety provisions you have, the more and more likely it's becoming that those serious consequences shall arise, and one must be prepared.
All right, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Now, I'm sorry, Mr. Millett. Now you want to go on to...
Yes, may I? Thank you. Yeah, can I please ask that the witness be shown day 167, page 95. I'm just going to show you just over a page of Mr. Todd's evidence. And we can start at page 95, line 1. Day 167, page 95, line 1. In fact, line 1 is an answer to a question which starts at the bottom of page 166, if we can just go to that. Sorry, page 94, if we can go to that. And at the bottom of 94, you could see that there's a question based on the passages of the LGA guidance I've just shown you.
Yeah.
Question, it looks from this LGA guide that it contemplated the possibility of compartmentation failing. Yes, sir, that's correct. Question, even if it was rare. The question at line 3, do you agree that if compartmentation were to fail, or taking your word from yesterday, be bypassed, that would present a serious and imminent danger to relevant persons in the building? It could do, yes. Do you agree also that the responsible person should ensure that a resident can evacuate as quickly and as safely as possible in the event that compartmentation either failed or was bypassed? Yes, and that's why we have protected stairways, protected lobbies, smoke control, and so on. Yes. Do you also agree that the responsible person was required to establish and to give effect to a procedure to be followed in that eventuality, even if rare? Yes, and that's why the standard fire procedure notice would say what I said it would say. Question, does that tell us that the responsible person was obliged to assess the means of escape, both when the stay-put strategy is in force and when it was revoked, because, for example, compartmentation had failed or was bypassed? Answer, yes, it goes to the same thing, the fire procedure. And then if we turn the page. Question, yes, so was it not your understanding, and forgive the double negative, or the understanding of the trade, that the responsible person wasn't required to put in place any evacuation arrangement in the event that compartmentation failed or was bypassed, but would simply leave it up to the fire and rescue service to do whatever it needed to do by way of evacuation? And he says at line 8, no, because they would need protected stairways by which residents could evacuate, or the fire and rescue service could evacuate people who could not evacuate themselves. That's why we regard the staircase as sacrosanct. Now, I've read you quite a lot of that. Is there anything in the passage I've read you with which you disagree?
Well, can we go back a page?
Yes.
I mean, it's hard to do this without talking directly to
long
Mr.
passage.
Todd. No, but just so I'm interested to read. That's why the standard fire procedure notice would say what I said it would say. Did he say that the standard fire procedure notice gives information about what to do in the event of a total evacuation?
No, I don't believe so.
Yeah.
So
I don't understand, therefore, what he said in here. Standard fire action notices don't, as far as I'm aware, address the total evacuation scenario. They talk about the thing we mentioned right at the start: in the event of a fire, make your way down the staircase.
I see.
So I don't know if Mr. Todd just simply means that instruction, or he was communicating that he uses fire procedure notices that give a total evacuation communication.
Right. Let me see if I can ask you the question in a more succinct way then, but rather than by reference to what his evidence was. Do you agree with this proposition, or disagree with this proposition, that the responsible person should assess the means of escape both when stay put applies in the standard way and when compartmentation fails?
So I hope I've been clear so far, and I can't say it differently now. It's much more practical and reasonable to focus on the compartmentation and making sure that is reliable, then assume it shall fail and make the really complex arrangements that will be required to deal with that event.
Thank you.
Okay. I actually, this exchange as presented to me here, I don't think it's actually touching on total versus some kind of partial evacuation. That's not how I read it. Okay.
Very well.
I think, well, I shouldn't say what I think Mr. Todd might mean. He needs to say that.
No, that's
Yeah.
also essential.
Yeah, but fire action notices don't, as a rule, say, in the event of a total evacuation order, please do the following.
Now, can we then turn to the evacuation strategy for disabled persons specifically?
Yeah.
And I want to look at this question in a little bit more detail. Can we start by looking at BS 9991 from 2015, which is at BSI 6059. This is page 1, and it's entitled Fire Safety in the Design, Management and Use of Residential Buildings Code of Practice. Yeah. Did that British standard apply to existing residential high-rise buildings such as Grenfell Tower?
Do you mean apply as in, I mean, it's relevant and it's available to read, but I mean the order, the order doesn't direct you to it. I mean, I think it contains really helpful information for someone with an existing building.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
And if we look at page 2, we can see a bit of history. If we go to page 2, you can see that it was first published in 2011, December 2011, and then published in October 2015 as the second, then present edition. If we go to page 9, under the third heading on that page, it says relationship with other publications. Can you see that?
Yeah.
and it says this standard complements BS 9999, which excludes individual dwelling houses, certain residential buildings, and specialised housing from its scope. BS 9991 provides guidance on all these building types. And on the same page, if you look a little bit lower down, under this, at the section under the heading Use of this document, in the second paragraph, the first paragraph, it says there might be circumstances where it's necessary to use one publication to supplement another, but care needs to be given when using a pick and mix approach, as it's essential to ensure that an integrated approach is used in any one building. And then it goes on to say, as a code of practice, this British standard takes the form of guidance and recommendations and should not be quoted as if it were a specification, and particular care should be taken to ensure that claims of compliance are not misleading. Any user claiming compliance with this British standard is expected to be able to justify any course of action that deviates from its recommendations. Now, we can see that it's a code of practice. Can you just help us? What was its status as a code of practice? Was it guidance? Was it binding? Who would enforce it?
Well, all British standards are non-statutory guidance documents. I mean, there's a document that explains all of that.
Would it be reasonable, in your opinion, for the TMO to have ignored it?
Would it have been reasonable to ignore it? I don't think so. I think I've been clear in my report. I mean, personally, I think it's good to read all the guidance documents. So if you look at 9991 and the LGA together, there are some very interesting decisions that need to be made as a result of reading them together.
There are. We'll come to that.
So, and that's all part of having enough knowledge to carry out your job. I mean, the TMO, I mean, this is a really theoretical question, isn't it? Because the use or not by the TMO of 9991 hasn't played a massive part in didn't play a massive part in their day-to-day activities nor my analysis.
No.
Do I think that Miss Ray and Mr. Stokes should have known about this British standard and might like to have read it to understand the latest advice? I think they should, yes.
Thank you. Now, if we go to page 10 at the foot of the page, you can see that one of the pieces of legislation that's referred to specifically is the RRO.
Yeah.
Yes. And if we go to page 33, and I'm just going to show you 3 pages or 4 pages from this document. If we go to page 33, there's a section entitled Inclusive Design there, and a note underneath that. And it says, in the note, attention is drawn to the Equality Act 2010, which places a duty on all employers and service providers not to discriminate against disabled people. It is vital to ensure that when making plans for the fire safety and management of buildings, the requirements of disabled people are properly taken into account at all times. It is important to note that recommendations given in this British standard are for escape, not access. Is it your opinion that that obligation identified there applied to the responsible person and their duties under the RRO?
It's not for me to, give a view on the Equalities Act.
No, all right, let me try.
But just so I'm clear, I know from reading the approved document B and from reading standards like this that it is a duty of other people and it causes a fire safety professional, technically, to have to consider any type of person in a building. But I can't give any expert opinion on that act.
Can you help us to this extent? Do you know whether the industry understood the obligation as identified in this note that I've read to you between the years 2010 and 2016?
That the whole industry knew something for 6 years.
Well, to the best of your knowledge, being a participant in this industry at the time, from what you knew, was this something that was widely complied with, or?
Well, I answered those questions earlier, I think, didn't I?
Or just remind me.
I told you that it's the area where I've had greatest difficulty in agreeing that people with vulnerabilities need to be incorporated into both design and in protective measures in operation. I can't say more than that.
When you say agreeing, do you mean buy-in from your clients?
I do mean that.
Yes, I see. Thank you. Now, if we go on, I'll just show you one or two extra bits here. Page 145, paragraph 54. Evacuation of disabled occupants or occupants that require assistance to escape.
Yeah.
And you can see note 1 under that. It is the responsibility of the premises management to assess the needs of all people to make a safe evacuation when formulating evacuation plans. An evacuation plan should not rely on the assistance of the fire and rescue service. This is an important factor that should be taken into account in the building design.
Yeah.
And if we go to page 175, you can see at page 175, it says there, under the heading Management of Additional Needs and Disabilities, the penultimate paragraph, fire safety management needs to take into account the full range of people who might use the premises, paying particular attention to the needs of disabled people with permanent or temporary impairment. And then if you look at the last paragraph under E2, people with mobility impairments, assumptions cannot be made about the abilities of wheelchair users. It can be helpful to produce a personal emergency evacuation plan, PEEP, to explore the level of need and what they are to do in the event of a fire in their own home or one nearby. If direct escape to a place of ultimate safety is not possible, horizontal escape to another fire compartment can be explored.
Yeah, I'm sorry, can I just interrupt you? It also says the UK has an ageing society with increasing levels of interdependence into later years, etc., in standard residential accommodation who have a range of impairments which could affect their ability to evacuate or follow procedures.
Yes.
So there's all these different categories of vulnerability clearly set out in 9991.
Yes, thank you, absolutely. Now, the bit I've read to you and the bit you've also pointed out to us, do you agree that that suggests that when the responsible person is planning for fire safety and management of fire safety in a building, including evacuation planning, consideration should be given to that range of people?
Yes, I do.
And do you agree that any evacuation strategy for disabled residents, whether permanent or temporary, would also need to take into account all 3 fire scenarios that we looked at? So fire in the flat, fire near the flat, and all occupants in the event of an all-out.
So I think the evacuation method, so how to leave, is how do I put this? You know, it's the same, isn't it? Regardless of the fire scenario, in a way, you just need to be able to leave the building. I've been clear. I think you're trying to, you're hoping I'll give a view on total evacuation planning for high-rise residential buildings. And I have to keep saying, because it's fair, you're not meant to end up in that position that as a matter of course, you plan for such a complex evacuation. But any person in a building, in the event of a fire, needs some way to exit.
Yes. Whether the fire is in their flat, or whether the fire is in their neighbour's flat, or in the rare but not unforeseeable instance that the fire and rescue service command.
Exactly. You're on the phone and you're told to leave.
Yes, thank you. Now can I show you the LGA guidance? HOM 30 is 45964, page 120, paragraph 79.9. I'll read it to you. In general needs blocks of flats, it can equally be expected that a resident's physical and mental ability will vary. It is usually unrealistic to expect landlords and other responsible persons to plan for this or to have in place special arrangements such as personal emergency evacuation plans. Such plans rely on the presence of staff or others available to assist the person to escape in a fire. Now, having looked together at the provisions of BSI 9991 of 2015, which admittedly is some 4 years after the publication of this guidance in July 2011.
Yeah.
Are you able to help us reconcile what I've just read to you here in the LGI guide with the 2015 British standard?
Yeah, no, I can't help reconcile it, and I've been clear about that in my report with 9991 or any other guidance document.
Are you able to shed any light on why they, in your opinion, cannot be reconciled?
Yeah, so if we take a technical view as opposed to any other view, so technically what this means is if responsible persons in this category here have decided it's unrealistic to, place special arrangements or to do PEEPs, we're back to risk acceptance. So the technical significance of this is that the risk caused by not making any other arrangement is an acceptable risk to the responsible person. That's the technical meaning of the words there. Okay? By not making any other arrangement, a risk level is fixed in the building for any vulnerable person who cannot use this, say it's a single means of escape stair. That's what that text is. There, I am not able to explain the thinking or the consideration of risk acceptance and risk levels that went into the agreement to write that text. I'm not able to help you there, and I think it would be very helpful to understand why that was concluded as an acceptable risk level. I'm going to keep saying in the technical context, okay, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you. Now, can I then turn to a different topic, a slightly different topic, which is the responsibilities of the fire risk assessor to assess the means of escape. Can we start, as we, I think, have now become habitually to do, with PAS 79, CTA 703, page 44. I'd like to go to, it's subheading Roman 23 in the left-hand column in the second paragraph. And you'll see that when it comes up. PAS 79, page 44. Ooh. No, it's CTA 703. Yes. And if you look at left-hand column, Roman 22, I'm so sorry, Roman 23, means of escape. And it says this, in considering the likely consequences of fire, the fire risk assessor needs to consider the likely effects of fire on escape routes, C 3.20, during the escape time, 3.21, taking into account the time for detection of fire and raising the alarm. See commentary on clause 15, fire detection and warning. This requires a thorough evaluation of the means of escape. Yeah. So do you agree that the fire risk assessor's assessment would include an assessment of the means of escape in a high-rise residential block?
Yeah, I think, I think they should understand, say, travel distance, widths, and what that means. Yeah. Yes.
And we can see the 5 critical factors identified if you cast your eye to the right-hand column.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
27.
Yeah, those basic, because there is an implication there about some very complex analysis, but on the right, the 5 critical factors are a reasonable expectation.
Yes, and I just want to focus on E, where it says the ability of occupants to use the escape routes. Yeah. Now, do you agree or disagree that a fire risk assessor should or perhaps must take into account all of these critical factors when assessing the means of escape?
Yes, I think they should.
Yes. And that would include E, would it? The ability of occupants
yes.
to use the escape routes?
Yeah, because it's the only way to establish the risk level.
Yeah. And does that include all occupants?
Yes, it does, yeah.
And not only the able-bodied ones?
No, as far as I'm concerned, I understand we've read the LGA guide, okay, and what that says. But my understanding and my reading of every other guidance document is that it's everybody, not some people.
Right. Thank you. Now, if we look at the next paragraph down at Roman 28, it says, it can normally be anticipated that occupants with disabilities are or are likely to be present on the premises, and consideration needs to be given to arrangements for their evacuation in the event of fire. In most multi-storey premises, designated refuges, C3.75, are likely to be necessary as temporary waiting spaces, and there will be a need for arrangements to assist mobility-impaired occupants to escape from the refuges during using staircases and or specially designated evacuation lifts, C3.22, or firefighting lifts, which can be used to evacuate disabled people by people in the premises at least until arrival of the fire and rescue service.
Yeah.
Now, do you agree that PAS 79 recommends that the fire risk assessor assesses the arrangements for the evacuation of occupants with a disability?
Yes, I do.
Basically what it says.
Yeah, no, exactly, yeah. And it's very similar to what Mr. Todd wrote in the risk assessments for Grenfell Tower.
Mr. Todd? Mr.
Oh,
Stokes.
sorry, Freudian slip. Mr. Stokes, Mr. Stokes, massive apologies.
And do you agree that a fire risk assessor should also take into account all of those factors, as I've identified to you in Roman 28, when carrying out an assessment for a high-rise residential block?
Yeah, I think they, because the reality is not every block has all these facilities, okay? So it's important to explain the consequences when they're not there, and then how you can rely on them when they are there. So they absolutely need to be clear on the availability of all the different protections listed there in that paragraph.
Is there anything that you've seen or know about in this PAS which says that you can take a different approach if collecting and maintaining information on who is disabled is too much of a burden for you?
That the PAS says if it's too much of a burden, you don't need to know about it. Sorry, is that what you mean?
That's a better way of putting
no,
it.
I haven't read that in the PAS. I mean, that's implied in the LGA, but it's not written in the PAS.
Right. Now, Mr. Todd's evidence was that PAS 79 was focused on non-domestic premises, and he said it wasn't meant to, and I'm summarising, I hope fairly, to apply to domestic premises.
Yeah.
And he said that was the majority of opinion of the fire risk assessment trade. That's day 167, page 102, 5 to 14.
Yeah,
I hope I've summarised what he says there, but
Yeah.
what he says there is his evidence as opposed to my summary of it. But if I've captured that correctly, can you comment on that?
Well, I mean, very unfortunately, I didn't get that memo or whatever, so I did not know that.
Right.
And it doesn't say that in PAS 79. So I don't know how it became the commonly understood view when carrying out fire risk assessment that you couldn't use PAS 79 in residential buildings. And I'm also aware of all sorts of fire risk assessments for residential buildings that do refer to PAS 79. Just based on my limited experience relative to a whole trade, that's all I can say.
Mr. Todd also said that a fire risk assessor would know which parts of PAS 79 applied to high-rise residential buildings and which were only for commercial premises because the fire risk assessor would have the relevant training, education and experience. That's day 16, pages 105, line 19 to 106, page 10. Can you...
What are you really asking me? That you're trained to ignore disabled people?
That's a rather more blunt way of asking.
But is that what you're asking me?
Well, let's try that. What's the answer to that question?
Well, so if people are trained to ignore disabled people as so-called common practice, I don't consider it to be acceptable practice. And I'm not aware that people are trained to not incorporate certain categories of people in a fire risk assessment. No, I'm not aware of that, but probably you need to. I think you've had all the evidence on that.
Well, let me just, I don't want there to be any misunderstanding about this. Can I then show you what he said? It won't take long. Day 167, please, page 105. And let's go to line 19. Day 167, page 105, line 19. And there's quite a long run up to this. The question, I think, probably starts at 15. Do I take it from the answers you've been giving that although that's written, it wasn't actually intended to be that way and in practice not understood that way? Answer, there would be certain aspects that would apply to a high-rise block of flats. So, for example, fire prevention, keeping escape routes clear, not having combustibles in escape routes, all of these things would be applicable to a high-rise block of flats just as much as to any other building. So, unfortunately, it would be a bit of a curate's egg. There would be bits of PAS 79 that would be entirely applicable to a high-rise block of flats, and there would be bits such as that on which you've honed in that would clearly not really apply to a block of flats. Question, how would your average fire risk assessor know which bits to apply and which bits not to apply when going along to a fire risk assessor building like Grenfell Tower? Answer, because they had the appropriate education, training and experience to apply the principles of fire safety. Can you comment one way or the other on that?
I mean, it's not for me to kind of discuss what Mr. Todd said, but my professional opinion is that when you have the appropriate education, training and experience to apply the principles of fire safety, you will very much understand that any vulnerability that impacts evacuation increases the risk level in a building, and you will know that the order requires you to be clear on risk level to all relevant persons, and you will very much incorporate them then in a classic fire risk assessment.
Can we then go back to PAS 79, please, and look at where we were, which is at page 44, and look at the next Roman paragraph down, 19, Roman 19 at the bottom of the page. It says this, disabled evacuation strategy, and I emphasise those two words, disabled evacuation strategy should not rely on rescue of disabled people by the fire and rescue service. Assistance with their evacuation is provided by persons within the premises. A two-way speech communication system within the refuge might be necessary so that disabled persons can make their presence known and receive reassurance. It might also be necessary for fire doors to be held open by automatic release mechanism, C3.5, to make the premises more accessible for mobility impaired people.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Now, would a fire risk assessor's assessment of the means of escape need to ensure that the relevant persons can evacuate without assistance, including those persons with a disability?
Without assistance from the fire and rescue service? Yes, we are all meant to know that, yes.
Yes. Yeah. Were you aware of a predominant view, or even if not a predominant view, a commonly held view in the fire risk assessment trade up to June 2017 that to the effect that those provisions I've just read to you, particularly Roman 19, did not apply to disabled persons in high-rise residential premises? No,
I'm not. I don't think that at all. I think the enforcing authority were very clear about that, actually, in my experience of buildings, because there was an older commonly held view before the order came in, and I went back and looked at my files. The first few years when the order was in practice, still some responsible persons still thought the fire and rescue service, for example, would come to the refuge and bring the people out for evacuation purposes. But I probably thought that we all knew that they didn't do that anymore, and I thought they communicated that quite widely. But I mean, I think you should look into that beyond my view.
Yeah. Were you aware of a view in the trade at the time, whether predominant or common, that in the case of a residential building, particularly a high-rise residential building, the responsible person didn't need to bother with Roman 19 because it didn't have staff on the premises at the time to be able to assist with evacuation?
Yeah, so now we're getting to the real nub of the problem, aren't we? Because not having staff on the premises is a decision the responsible person takes.
Yes. And were you aware?
And obviously, when you're trying to solve the problem of people who can't walk or get themselves down the stairs, it can typically end up relying on another person, and where the responsible person makes the active decision not to provide that assistance, again, back to risk, just keeping it in the technical risk zone, that has consequences with respect to the risk level in the building.
And we saw in Roman 18 the reference to assisting mobility impaired occupants to escape into and out of refuges.
Yes, yes.
Mr. Todd's evidence, day 167, page 102, lines 17 to 25, is that he's never seen a block of flats with a designated refuge. What is your view about that?
I have seen high-rise residential buildings with refuges.
Right.
But I think we're probably straying into the territory of a certain category of high-rise residential building, probably is where you're trying to get me to. And that if people don't provide refuges there, when they do in other types of high-rise residential buildings in England.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a matter of practice, could a communal lobby serve as a refuge for a disabled person who's...
It would be better to use, say, if you look at Grenfell Tower, when you open the stair door, it would be better to, if it was possible, to find some space on the other side of that door.
Yes.
Okay, but I don't want to get into redesigning the lobby of Grenfell Tower. But there are ways to provide another little protected zone. But you still can't leave everybody there. They have to be able to be evacuated.
Let me try and put it slightly more colloquially. Would it be acceptable for a responsible person to say, well, I have no staff on the premises and my building has got no refuges, therefore I can ignore the need to pay attention to occupants with disabilities' needs to escape?
No, they can't say I can ignore. They say, I've decided that's a risk worth taking. That's the risk I'm imposing on this cohort of relevant persons, and that's where we are. But can we just get back to Grenfell? They had just done a refurbishment of that building that touched on lifts, very much touched on the lobbies. And, you know, it has to be considered in that regard, you know, the opportunity to contemplate a means for evacuation of people who required assistance in Grenfell Tower.
And was that opportunity taken on what you've seen?
We know that that opportunity was not taken. And that's why it's important to always bring this back to Grenfell Tower, not keep asking me about, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of buildings in this country. At Grenfell Tower, they had just finished a refurbishment which included works in the lobby and included the lifts. And the risk assessment said the lifts could be used for evacuation of different types of people.
And so that everybody's clear, we will come back to lifts.
Okay, good. Yeah, okay.
Now, can I then turn to a subset of this topic, which is identification of persons especially at risk?
Yeah.
If we stick with past 79, please, and go to page 36, let's look at the commentary on clause 12. This is about relevance of information about the premises, the occupants and the processes. And if you cast your eye to the right-hand side, the right-hand column, and look at the bottom, there's a little Roman 8, which says, particular account needs to be taken of occupants who could be especially at risk in the event of fire. And then in red, note 1, attention is drawn to the relevant fire legislation, which requires that other than in the case of certain very small businesses, fire risk assessments record any group of persons especially at risk.
Yeah.
And then 9, particular care needs to be taken to ensure that due account is taken of disabled occupants who are often especially at risk in the event of fire in view of the possible need for assistance with evacuation or special warning of fire. All forms of disability need to be considered, including mobility impairment, deafness, blindness, learning difficulties, and mental illness.
Yeah.
Now, is it your understanding that persons especially at risk should be identified as part of a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment?
It's my understanding because I've read the order and that's what it tells me to do.
That's your understanding of the order. Was it your experience that was commonly understood in the industry?
Persons especially at risk, yes. I think the average fire risk assessor, whatever that may mean, understands what persons especially at risk is and their duty to record them.
Duty to record them, and does that mean that they would need to be told of the occupants and their individual needs?
So they need to be told, or they need to be asked, or they need to warn what assumptions they've made.
In your experience, was it necessary? Let me ask it differently. In your experience, did the fire risk assessment trade or the responsible person, the body of people comprising responsible persons, understand that they had to have in place a system to identify and record those persons especially at risk?
A system in place. I don't know that people understood they needed a system in place. That's the next step.
Right. Okay.
It
regardless of system.
Depends on the organisation, but
right.
Anyway. But I think system's a different word. Sorry.
Right. Well, we'll come to system in a moment, perhaps. But were you aware of a view amongst fire risk assessors up to 2017? June 2017, that it wasn't necessary for them or for the responsible person to collate information about individuals especially at risk in residential premises because it wasn't practical to collate and maintain that information?
Yeah, I'm aware that there is that body of thought, but I'm also aware of another body of thought that you have to make some attempt to understand the persons in your building. And there's actually, when you read out that 9991, for example, this issue of the ageing population particularly and how things are changing, how the occupancy profile is changing in residential buildings is something quite commonly discussed. So there has been an awareness that the percentage of people requiring assistance has been changing in the last few decades. Okay, so I think the question was again about an entire industry, and I'm saying to you that there was a body of thought that they didn't. Well, they simply didn't do it. I don't know why, but there are other bodies that did try to do it. That's my experience.
And if we go to page 37, let's look at the last paragraph on the left-hand side, which is Roman 14, which says, the most important purpose of considering and recording occupants, especially at risk in the event of fire, is to ensure that adequate provisions are in place to protect such occupants from fire. Having recorded such occupants within the fire risk assessment, it needs to be clear within the documented significant findings that there are provisions to ensure the safety of these occupants.
Yeah.
These occupants. Now, considering that guidance there, is it right that the responsible person, to your understanding, would need to ensure that there are adequate provisions in place to protect those occupants?
As I've said, yes.
Yes. And was it your understanding that that's not a generic requirement, but on the other hand, or to the contrary, each and every individual occupant, especially at risk, needs to be considered in a suitable and sufficient FRA?
Each individual occupant?
Yes.
I think that mightn't always be possible. I think that I would go so far as to say an awareness of, say, certain types of impairment and understanding what was possible to protect someone with that impairment as a minimum. Getting into every single individual is the next level.
You say the next level. Is it something that was contemplated as necessary.
Contemplated necessary by all the people I've never met again.
No, but I was going to say contemplated as necessary by PAS 79.
Yeah.
If you look at...
I mean, it doesn't say... I think the focus of your question is about an individual.
Well, that's why I asked the question. You see, Roman 14, let's look at it again, says...
It says occupants.
Is having recorded such occupants. And my question is, looking at the guidance, was it the understanding of those words that actually descended to the level of each and every individual occupant?
Yeah. I think my reading of that, so it's recording occupants and to protect such occupants from fire, my reading of that is there tends to be, I mean, I set it out in chapter 6, a certain number of impairments that impact evacuation, and you can do it at that level. I don't think this particular paragraph says on a very individualistic and bespoke basis.
Do you agree that it's looking at the other way around?
Yeah.
It wouldn't be reasonably sufficient simply to record the number of residents at risk as a lump number?
I think that's more helpful than doing nothing. And if it's also incorporated into the risk, the risk level given at the end, and being transparent about what it means for those particular for that particular cohort.
Was a personal emergency evacuation plan one means of assessing what provisions are necessary to meet an occupant's needs?
Yes, so when you're getting into, a very bespoke plan for a particular individual, my understanding, that's what a PEEP is for. But I think before you get to the individual level, remember, mobility impairment causes certain issues during evacuation. Mental health issues, certain types, will cause a different type of impact in an evacuation. So I think it's important to understand there's a generic way to understand the impact on evacuation for different impairment types long before you get to having to do one plan for one person, if that makes sense. So there's plenty of help out there to understand the consequences of certain impairments when it comes to evacuation. It's not only possible to understand that by doing a PEEP uniquely. That's what I wanted to say.
Right.
I don't know if I've been...
On the other side, would the responsible person, in your opinion, need to make sure that anybody identified as especially at risk,
Yes.
by reason of having a disability,
Yes.
should be considered for a personal emergency evacuation plan?
Should be considered for personal emergency plan? Yes. Yes, I think so. I mean, yes, in the sense that they can describe to that person the provisions in the building and how to use them, or what assistance will be provided to them.
Does it follow from that in fact the responsible person, leave aside the fire risk assessor for the moment, but the responsible person at least needed to identify each and every individual occupant who was especially at risk?
Yeah, so I'm trying to say to you that before you get to that point of every single individual, the impact of generic types of impairment cause technical issues, if you want to put it that way, for evacuation planning. So there's that long before you get to talking to an individual. You need to know the person's especially at risk to understand the scale of the issue in your building.
And following on from that, is this right, to prepare a personal emergency evacuation plan for such residents, should it be necessary?
Should it be necessary? Yes.
I see. So
can I put it just a bit more bluntly?
Yes.
If for example, if you have a building and the lift can't be used in the event of a fire,
yeah,
and a person is a wheelchair user and cannot get down the stairs in extreme circumstances, in a way, you know the consequences of that before you sit down and speak with them about their plan. I don't want to say the only way anyone can find out what's needed is by preparing a plan. I think a plan is part of making arrangements for people.
I think I understand better.
I'm probably just trying to be a bit overly precise, but I think it's very important, because I think PEEP and the use of PEEPs has a meaning on its own almost now culturally, whereas the impact of impairment on escape technically is well understood, and the consequences of it.
So just going, I think I understand what you're saying. If you go back to Roman 14, the opening words are, the most important purpose of considering and recording occupants, especially at risk in the event of fire, is to ensure that adequate provisions are in place to protect such occupants from fire.
Yeah.
Is your evidence, your opinion, that there's this staged process, and the first part of the process is to work out what the risks are posed to occupants as a class?
Yeah, exactly. So if for X category, what does that mean? Y category, what does that mean? Next step, what is the scale of the issue in my specific premises?
So you might have a building.
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt you. You might have a building where, despite the fact that there is a substantial number of vulnerable persons in it, that nobody is especially at risk because of the design of the building. Exactly.
Right. Okay. That's exactly it.
Right. Got it. Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, and therefore, it would follow from that where you take a building which has active and passive fire prevention and protection measures, which do, for whatever reason, mean that some of the occupants are especially at risk because of that, and because of their disabilities, they have to be taken into account specifically.
Exactly.
And individually.
Yeah, exactly. So you're meant to understand persons especially at risk. You understand if there's any existing provisions that can help them. They have greater exposure to harm because of their disability or impairment. You see what protection exists in the building and what the resulting risk level is. Otherwise, yes, they remain persons especially at risk, and something has to be done, or we're back to accepting that the responsible person is doing nothing.
And would it follow from that, and the debate that we've just had leading up to it, that the fire risk assessor is the person where a fire risk assessor is doing the fire risk assessment for the responsible person, who must advise the responsible person what the risks are in the building, which mean that there are occupants especially at risk?
Yeah, which mean that occupants with certain types of impairment will become specially at risk because of the features in that building.
Right. And therefore, would it follow from that that the responsible person is normally entitled to look to the fire risk assessor to advise it that it should be collating information on particular occupants because of the risks presented by the building?
Because of the risks presented by the building, yeah. Yeah, am I allowed to think about that? Probably not. No, I think. You see, it depends on. This is where the kind of scale of the role the fire risk assessor has, and that's why I said earlier, minimum warn of the problem, escalating up to, if you're working with a responsible person who does have a system to collate information, then that's a different category in my mind. Okay.
Yes, and you've looked at that information.
Yeah.
I'm going to come to that in just a moment. What I was really trying to get to the bottom of is whether it's your opinion that the assessment of the building, the risks in the building, which would mean that occupants, especially at risk, would have to be identified individually, is something that would be a function of a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment.
I understand what you mean. So if you're in a building, there's no lift, let's say the fire doors are defective, you're worried about the internal wall, one of the many things you would, notify the responsible person about is, look, you need to understand that anyone who can't get down the stairs swiftly in the event of a fire in this building is particularly exposed to harm because of the features of your building. So again, it's all about that risk level. So yes, they need to warn the responsible person and tell them what the risk, the extra risk level is for those people. You can go on to say, I strongly advise you to look into your existing processes to understand the percentage of people in this property that cannot leave this building swiftly in a reasonable fire.
Now, then coming to the information available to the TMO as the next subtopic, you reviewed the TMO's processes, I think, for gathering information about residents, including their vulnerabilities, and you covered that, I think, in section 10 of chapter 6. Can we look at a little bit of that, please? BLARP 25034, page 189.
Can I just be clear that the only reason I did that, in case people are interested, is because it was cited in the fire risk assessment.
Indeed.
That's the only reason. And I think it's really important that this particular fire risk assessor for this particular building did go to the trouble of citing a particular management process in the preparation of his risk assessment, and that's why I looked at it, because it doesn't happen everywhere.
Now, if you go to paragraph 10.8.36, this is under the heading Summary of the Recorded Number of Vulnerable Persons, and I know this may be the subject of amendment in a later report, but you say, I've reviewed the evidence and confirmed the following information.
Yeah.
And then that table continues over to page 190.
Yeah.
And
yeah, just to be clear, that table is not changing.
That table's not changing, thank you. That's helpful. And it lists the type of information recorded by the TMO, including in the first column, the system type. And if we go back to page 189, you can see TP tracker.
Yeah.
And then underneath that, just reading it through, Civica W2, EDRMS or Capita Housing, Ryden Information Gathering Exercise, David Noble's spreadsheet on the night of the fire from CRM or Capita, and then on the next page, tenancy creation or tenancy audit. So those are the sources or systems. Are those all the systems of recording information that includes information about individual vulnerable residents that you saw?
With respect to the TMO? With
respect to the TMO.
Well, in the evidence available to me, that's all I could find.
Would you have expected Janice Ray, as the competent advisor within the responsible person, to review that information whenever a fire risk assessment was being carried out? Yes,
because Janice Ray accepted Mr. Stokes' risk assessment every year, and the statutory risk assessment stated it was relying on the TP tracker process.
Yeah. And would you expect Janice Ray, as the competent advisor, the responsible person, to make that information available to Mr. Stokes?
So,
if it existed.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this is the problem about talking about Grenfell. So if the competent person for the responsible person and the risk assessor said every time for Grenfell, and I think it's all the other high-rise buildings as well, every single time we're relying on X process and the following is the risk level, absolutely every single time the risk assessment was done, I would expect it was asked for or given. I'm not going to give a view. I think it's obvious that both should occur. Yes. Otherwise, you don't write it into your statutory risk assessment.
Would it be, and I need to be careful distinguishing between normal practice and acceptable practice, but would it be normal practice for a responsible person in charge of management of a high-rise residential building to hold records which did not contain up-to-date information about at least about the total numbers of vulnerable persons in their building?
Would it be normal? I can't.
Have you come across that?
I can't. Why are you you're asking me about up-to-date records, about the KCTMO's tenancy process or the vulnerable people living in their properties? I think I shouldn't answer. I think I shouldn't answer that question, and I think there's a very important point here and a piece of work that's needed, to establish well considered and evidenced common practice in that domain about how tenants.
I mean, let me try the question in a different way. As a participant in the fire risk assessment industry over a number of years, did you ever get to know that there was a practice whereby responsible persons didn't maintain up-to-date and accurate?
I have worked with people who are not sure or don't know the percentage of persons that may be especially at risk in their premises. But I just want to be very clear, where you do have a process, which is the situation at Grenfell, which is not necessarily the situation everywhere. I was asked to give a view on Grenfell. So for Grenfell, there was, I'm going to call it a management process in the context of an organisation. It was referred to in the risk assessment, and that brings it into that field of it having to be accurate. I don't want to talk about it in any generic sense.
All right, well then let's look at what Mr Stokes did. Can we go to chapter 6 of your report, section 13, at BLARP 25034, page 234. And you can see at paragraph 13.9.2 on that page, and this is part of your concluding points. You say, 13.9.2, as I explained in chapter 8, despite Mr Stokes's pro forma more or less being aligned with the pro forma in Annex B of PAS 79 2012, he did not include the helpful table it proposes in the general information section of the pro forma. There it directs the user to provide numbers of disabled occupants, young persons and lone workers, and then you set out figure 13.9, the excerpt from section 3 of Annex B of PAS 79. You go on to say at paragraph 13.9.4, I cannot find which part of Mr Stokes's fire risk assessments takes account of people with any disabilities, nor where it explains the so-called reasonable adjustments in order for those relevant persons not being placed at any substantial disadvantage. Would you expect, this is my question, would you expect a fire risk assessment to include a pro forma section identifying occupants especially at risk from fire?
So again, I mean, I'm not going to get hung up on the format or style, the style of the pro forma, but in terms of recognising the types of persons that may be especially at risk, I would expect it to be set out, and it's very commonly set out, as I have seen.
Whether or not in the form of a pro forma, perhaps that doesn't matter. Would you say that a fire risk assessment that does not set out that information remains suitable and sufficient?
No, because they've not expressed the persons they understand to be especially at risk. Mr Stokes' pro forma is, a very expansive pro forma in the context of a lot of other pro formas that exist out there.
Yes. And
he did have a section dedicated to disabled persons.
Yes, and we'll look at that now. Can we go to that? What I'm going to show you is his fire risk assessment for Grenfell Tower of the 20th of June 2016.
Okay,
That's at CST 403145. Let's go to page 23 in that, please. This is his section 13. It was always section 13, which had a title, Disabled People. You can see that on the screen there, Dr. Lane, and it says, it is considered that the building is provided with reasonable arrangements for means of escape for disabled people. Although it's expressed as a statement, there's a question mark at the end. It's clearly a question. An answer, tick, yes. And under comments or observations, he says this, and I'll read it to you. At the time of the risk assessment, there was no evidence of any resident within the premises who suffers from a sensory impairment that would prevent them from hearing a shouted warning of fire. TMO have introduced a comprehensive programme to gathering information about tenants, including any disabilities and their physical ability and mobility, to respond to any emergency situations. Can we turn the page, please? Any emergency situations. This information will be inputted on a TP tracker system and held centrally. The additional information will be used to assess if residents may require additional devices to provide them with early warning of smoke/fire in their home, and or development of a personal emergency evacuation plan, PEEPs. Both of the lifts in this building are firefighter/evacuation lifts and could be used as part of the evacuation strategy for disabled persons, but if these lifts were used, this would be under the control of the fire service if they were in attendance. Before the fire service arrived at this building, these lifts could be used by the residents or perhaps TMO/RBKC staff. Yeah. This policy is in accordance with the guidance given in the HM Government Risk Assessment document Sleeping Accommodation. I'd recommend that the staff are trained on how to use these firefighter/evacuation lifts, and that any keys needed are kept reasonably available. Yeah. I've read that at length to you. Now.
So it's a very comprehensive set of provisions for disabled people.
Now, Mr. Stokes told the inquiry in his oral evidence, and this is day 137 at page 107, lines 5 to 15, and I'm summarising it, I hope fairly, that he was not told that the TP tracker subscription that the TMO had was discontinued in September 2013.
Yeah, that's correct.
Which is why he never removed the reference to it in his risk assessments thereafter. And we do see it thereafter in October 2014, April 2016 and June 2016.
That's correct, yes.
Would you expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to ensure that the information recorded in the fire risk assessment is current and up to date as at the time of the assessment?
Yes, I would.
And would you have expected Mr. Stokes to check with the TMO on each occasion that he conducted a fire risk assessment what evidence the TP tracker held?
Yes, I would, because he wrote that in himself.
Now, Mr. Stokes, I better show you it. Mr. Stokes' evidence is at day 137, page 95. If we can just look at that. I'm going to show you about 3/4 of a page of transcript. Day 137, page 95. Yeah. He says that at line 8, question, I take it you didn't ask Janice Ray the question, is there anybody in this building who is disabled? Answer, I would expect them to tell me. Question, when you say this information will be inputted on a TP tracker system, can you explain why you didn't check the TP tracker system yourself to make sure that there truly was no evidence of any resident within the premises suffering even from a sensory impairment to their ears? Well, I'm not an employee of the TMO. I was a contractor. I couldn't just walk into their building and say, can I look at your systems? Question, but you could ask them. Answer, well, I would have asked them as part of an ongoing and expect them to tell me if they knew of anyone as well as. And I expected if Janice knew anyone, she would tell me as well. Question, you identified the system on which the information would be inputted. Did you not ask Janice Ray, Janice, please will you go to your TP tracker system and tell me from it who, as at today, is a disabled person for the purposes of my FRA? Did you ask her that question? Answer, no. Question, why not? Answer, because it would be, the onus would be on the occupier or the responsible person to tell the risk assessor that information. Question, is that not a very incurious approach for a fire risk assessor? Answer, no, I don't think so. And I'll show you the next question and answer. So was your approach quite simply to assume that there were no disabled people in the building, regardless of there being a system whereby you could find out or you could be told from it who they were, until you were actually told expressly in terms? Answer, well, I believe that's the criteria that's used in PAS 79, where in a general needs block of flats, it's very hard to find out if anyone has got disabilities. It's the landlord or the tenant management organisation or the managing agents of the building would have that information, not the risk assessor. Now, I've read that to you at length. Was Mr. Stokes's approach, Dr. Lane, as he's explained it there in that exchange, a normal and accepted approach to fire risk assessment?
In my opinion, it's not acceptable. Well, I mean, that's his opinion. So that's his opinion. For me, it's contradictory, because he's relied on that system by incorporating it into his risk assessment. And then in his evidence, he's saying that he had, I think really what I read here is he didn't actually have access to it and he didn't know what it contained. So he needed again to make that clear. I do want to make the point though, that I think the reader of the fire risk assessment, if they knew that system was obsolete, they should have corrected the risk assessment and return it. And they should have known, if they knew that's not what the fire risk management protocol and the KCTMO was, they needed to delete it urgently from their statutory risk assessment documents. So I don't see it as being all on Mr. Stokes. I'm afraid I'm saying Todd all the time. Mr. Stokes. And I think his oral evidence contradicts the firmness of the words he wrote in his risk assessment.
Thank you. I think you've just answered my next three questions.
Oh, so sorry. I'm actually getting very tired, I have to say.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
Well, given that, Mr. Chairman, I wonder whether now might be a convenient
I was going to say, would it be sensible to have a break?
It's 5 to 1. Let's do that.
Yeah, it's been a hectic morning.
I'm sure, and it's difficult following some of these questions. I understand that. Well, we'll break now. We'll come back at 2 o'clock, please.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
And
thank
again,
you.
please don't talk to anyone about anything to do with your evidence.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Mr. Bennett. I would say 2 o'clock,
Yes,
please.
thank you.